Hello and welcome to reInvent 2021 Day 1 Recap. My name's Mike. I'm calling from Brisbane, Australia, and joining me is Mark Nunnikhoven, calling from, I think, usually your spaceship hovering somewhere over Canada in safety. Hello, Mark. How are you?
I'm good. Thanks, Mike. I appreciate it. Yeah, I'm calling in from Ottawa, Canada. Not on site this year, first time ever. But like yourself, trying to get the most out of this virtually. And there's already a lot to talk about. So this is going to be a lot of fun.
Isn't there just? And I know you've been in high demand this morning. Oh, no, sorry. My this morning, your this evening,
Yes.
going from all of these different discussions. So it'd be interesting to see what came up in those discussions as well. So yeah, day one of reInvent. Typically, it's a bit of a slow day. Yes, we haven't had keynote presentations, so we haven't had big things, but we have had some announcements. So there are some things that are trickling out. And for some of us, I guess they're kind of interesting. Maybe just before we get into anything from today, let's just really quickly, I just want to talk about the announcement from last night, the first one from Midnight Madness. We covered it on this channel. We did a live stream. We had some videos come through. We saw dogs dancing around on stage. I think we've had time to digest that a little bit now. An awesome demo. It looked great, but it's probably not anything that any of us are going to use. Would you agree?
Yeah, fair. I mean, there's somebody out there who's going to use it. That's why they built it. And honestly, it solves a very real problem that even if you have two different types of robots, that's double the amount of work in the code to make sure. And the robots use a different programming language. There's a few standards. So having one unified platform is a really good thing. But yeah, it's a very niche thing, though I did do a short video earlier because it very much sounds like Skynet from Terminator, where we're connecting all the robots together to unify the data, to let them to talk to each other and collaborate on their own. And I'm like, is this really a good idea, people?
Yes, so that came up last night. Also, Black Mirror obviously always comes to mind whenever you see these things dancing around. That's okay, fine. I just wanted to cover that off because we did talk about it last night, and we were sort of, are we going to get an AWS robot dog? And no, we're not. No, we're not. So let's talk about what happened today. Let's talk about what some of the announcements are from today. And I don't know. Do you want to go first? Have you got some picks? I've got some ideas to talk about, but
sure.
What's top of your list?
Yeah, so I've been tracking all of them, which is nuts. I'm sure you're doing the same. We've all got little scripts in the background that are Lambdas that are peeling off all the stuff to give us alerts. And yep. I would say probably if we want to start, let's start with my wheelhouse is security. So AWS finally relaunched Amazon Inspector. So this was 2015 was when it originally launched.
Yeah.
So
yes, getting long in the tooth.
It was getting long in the tooth, and more importantly, I think, it's always done a good job. They've updated. So what Inspector does, let's cover that first.
Yes,
what Inspector does is it's a software vulnerability discovery and management service, right? So what it does is it looks at your EC2 instances, and it looks to see if things are out of date, if there's a known issue. So the easy example is, if you're running Apache and the web server, at least I'm still old that I refer to Apache as just that one project. So if you're running HTTPD and it's version 1.2.3.4 and .5 is out, and there was a security issue that was fixed, it will bubble up and say, hey, this is an old version. Here's the issue. Here's the potential remediation for it. So in this case, you could just patch. And that's a really important thing, right? Is to know what the vulnerabilities are, because you want to then mitigate them. And sometimes, mitigation means do nothing, but you need to be aware of it so that you can make the choice to do nothing as opposed to just having done nothing because you had no idea. So that's the core of Inspector.
And it's important, sorry, if I can say, it's not just, and so as you just described there, it's not just looking at operating system vulnerability. It was very much looking at the whole thing and looking for best practice on the whole server.
Correct. Yeah. So it's looking at operating system. It's looking at all the installed applications. It's looking at some basic configuration stuff. And then you start to get into another service called Guard Duty for the threat detection and things like that. But Inspector was looking at your OS and your apps and saying like, hey, are there issues here? Are there vulnerabilities that we need to know about? And when it launched in 2015, super useful. And it was part of that sort of that triplet or the quadruplet of Macie, Inspector, Config, and Guard Duty. And Macie never really took off that well until it got a revamp last year and still hasn't got its due because everyone's still got a bad taste in their mouth because it used to cost an arm and a leg, and now it just costs an arm. But Inspector has always been pretty solid. It's been sort of a stalwart, but it had some, like you said, it's showing its age. And so now they've completely rebuilt it, and they tackled some of the major issues with using the service today. So the biggest of those is that it's, well, I would say twofold. The biggest one for me was that it's now continual. It previously was you had to say, hey, Inspector, run an assessment. And then worse, Inspector would say, well, for how long? And it was never really clear what the damn difference was, if you excuse my profanity, okay, am I running a half an hour one or a 24-hour one? What results am I getting out of 24 hours that are so much better than 12? And it was a very narrow slice. And now it's continuous. So it's just always looking and always analyzing. So that's a huge boost. And then similarly on that line is the second bullet you'll see right there, the automated resource discovery. So instead of actually manually pointing it at something and say, hey, look at this, it's just looking at things all the time. It's finding things automatically from Amazon EC2, but also from ECR, from the Elastic Container registries.
Okay, so is it running across ECR, or is it actually running also inside of actual running containers? I guess ECR makes more sense because containers are a little bit more ephemeral.
It is. And the difference is right now it's using, so if you keep scrolling down, you'll see that they actually know it's already on there. The removal of the standalone inspector agent. So part of the, well, I won't say mistake, but one of the design choices in 2015 was that every service has its own agent. And that was just too many agents. So now inspector functionality is part of the systems manager agent, which is by default on the AMIs that are managed by AWS, but it's a little bulky to sit in a container. For some of those smaller container workloads. So it's just, Inspector's just looking at the registry for now, but you can run the agent on a container if you're okay with the performance hit. Okay,
so that sort of raises the question for me, and this is a genuine question. I don't know the answer to this, and I'm just softballing it to you. But what's the difference between ECR scan on push, which has been in there for a long time? You could do free scans of containers that you have up in there. You have daily free scanning of that, and you can trigger that when you actually push a new container up. What's the difference between that and what Inspector is going to give us? Because it's kind of overlaps by the sound of it.
Yeah, there is overlap for sure. To be honest, I don't have 100% of the details between the differences, but at the core is Inspector's more robust. And the way it reports its findings is it reports what's wrong, the potential remediation, but it pulls it up in the Amazon security finding format, data format, which is far more useful in the security world. It's still just a big JSON doc, but it's got structure. And so it's just a little more comprehensive. And I believe Inspector may be pulling in more threat sources as well. So it's not just doing the bare basics. So, but that's a great question. I'll write that down to dive in deeper, because it would be a very interesting difference between the two. Because Inspector obviously charges, right?
Absolutely, yes, and I guess and as we said, free scanning in ECR push with, I think, is it using Claire to do that? So that's because in my mind, when I was reading through this, and I haven't had as long to digest this stuff, because I didn't, well, I got up a while ago, but not that long ago. I was looking at this, and we've been looking at sort of intrusion detection inside of Kubernetes environments, for example, open source projects like Falco, that provide that sort of guard duty type of type of inspection of container running workloads. And I was wondering whether this was going to sort of nod in that direction and give us that sort of coverage of what was happening inside of the container world inside of ECS. I don't know. Maybe it's not. Maybe guard duty kind of already does that.
Yeah, and I think that's more for guard duty to extend into, which we may see this week, to be honest. So the way I always think of it is Inspector is just looking at the actual installed software. It's not looking at the behaviors. Guard duty is more behavior-based. What's going on? What's happening? Right, and what's the exposure there? That's why guard duty is billed as threat detection. It's sort of active, whereas this is looking at it and being like, hey, there's a hole in that wall. You're like, oh, okay. Guard duty is like, someone's coming through that hole. And you're like, oh, okay. So that's really the difference between the two. But regardless of the limits, and with any AWS service, it's always, you read the line in the blog post, you go, oh, that sounds amazing. You dive in, you're like, oh, okay. It's not there yet. It'll be there.
It's a start. It's a start.
It's a start. And so it's funny because just on my other screen, I've got Inspector booted up, and I fired up an old instance, an old AMI a while back, and I've yet to click in. I've yet to get the spare 5 minutes to click in to see if Inspector actually automatically finds this stuff now. But if it's even just that is enabled, the automatic asset detection and then scanning, even if that's the only thing out of the 10 big new features, that alone is worth it, because that was the big gap, is that you always had to remember to do this. You had to remember to process the results of the assessment, where now it's working and it just sends information when it finds something. That's a far better experience for people.
Sure. A far cry from where it first started, which was, I think one of the things you could do is actually produce a PDF report that you could then print out and give to your manager and say, look here, this is what the server looks like today. Now EventBridge, CloudWatch metrics, integration with Security Hub. Yes.
Yeah. And with orgs, with AWS orgs, one click, turn it on for everything. That's huge.
Yes. That is huge, and that's definitely the way to go. Now we're talking here a lot about security, Inspector. We talked about guard duty. We talked about organizations. That all, in my mind, leads to a nice, well-architected environment. Did you like that segue?
That was fantastic, and that wasn't even planned. That's just off the cuff. I like it. That's very well done.
I mean, the fact that I got a label pre-made, I mean, I wanted to talk about this. So, and we've sort of had a brief kind of, I like that you said you wanted a spare 5 minutes. Like, that doesn't happen in reInvent, not for you. So, wake up in the middle of the night and click that report. But let's talk AWS well architected, because that's in your wheelhouse as well, of course. And well architected, the well architected framework, maybe we should just recap what that is briefly.
Sure. Yeah. AWS well-architected framework. My view of it. So I teach this. I teach a course on the well-architected framework. I've been a huge fan for years. It's a set of principles to help you make the right decisions and trade-offs to build well in the AWS cloud. And there's 5 pillars. There is performance, efficiency, operational excellence, reliability, security, and cost optimization. And the idea is you can't have it all. How do you make the balance between those for your particular situation? And now on top of that, because it's easier to digest, there's been a whole bunch of best practices assigned, which I think is sort of secondary to that core idea of going, okay, Mike, we're building this product. What's important to us and what's important to our customer, and how do we balance that out? And so that's the core of the framework. And then they have the idea of these lenses. So I think there are currently 12 official lenses. Because they dropped 2 in the last 2 months, the media streaming lens and then the game industry lens. And what those are so the framework itself is a bunch of documents, right? They're PDF, they're HTML.
It's a knowledge base, right?
Exactly. That's the perfect word for it. It's a knowledge base. And the lenses are a specific look at either a vertical or a problem and applying the framework in that problem. So a really popular one is the SaaS lens. So if you're building a SaaS service, here are the things you need to worry about. And there's a phenomenal section in that lens about how to balance tenancy. So do you go, isolated tenants? Do you have full shared resources? How do you strike that balance? So it's talking about those kind of issues in the lenses. And they've got one for financial services. Management and governance is also a good one. High performance. Machine learning. Exactly. That one's right up your alley. Management and governance is super boring sounding, but there's some good nuggets in there. So that's the idea of a lens. It's a specific application of the framework to a vertical or problem set, which leads us to what did they announce today, Mike?
Yeah, sure. So what we've got custom lenses. So yeah, you talked about all those lenses that they've got set up, which have been developed, I guess, by the smarts and the knowledge and the connections that they have with customers. AWS have gone around and collected all of this best practice up. They've got these lenses. Now we've got custom lenses, and it sounds as though here we can now build our own lenses to be able to apply those to our workloads. Now, this to me sounds, there's probably a couple of different angles for it for me. One is very large enterprise. So you've got large enterprise with, if you have an enterprise architect, then you are a large enterprise, or you're trying to be. And that person is probably really interested in putting together some custom lenses for your environment to say, okay, this is what I want to see. Now, there's some parallels here. Like you've got things like actual services, which will actually do things like config and custom rules inside of config to actually go and look at what you've actually got in AWS. But this is talking about bigger things than necessarily just AWS, right? It's about practice. this? And are your managers on board with the change that you're doing? And are you training people on that kind of stuff? So custom lenses allows those kinds of people to put together, this is what I want my organization to adhere to, I suppose. And then it sort of will give them then a tool to track whether they're doing that. But it's an honesty-based system, right? You answer the questions, and if you, I'm fine with all of that stuff. Yeah, I'm patching my instances every day. The tool's not going to know if you're not doing that. So one thing, I think for large enterprise customers. The other side of this, I think, is potentially for the partner network. Maybe they can come up with lenses which work for particular industry verticals. I was scanning through the documentation before. They were making suggestions about sort of PCI compliance, SOC compliance, that kind of thing, which aren't currently lenses. Maybe there could be a lens generated for that. What's your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I think so. So I think the piece where we missed for the audience was that there's also something called the AWS well-architected tool.
Sure, yes.
Tool is an ambitious term here. It's essentially a questionnaire, right? And so what it is when you go, so you click that define workload button, and you don't have to do that now, but basically here it says, okay, what's the name of this workload? Give a description, blah, 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 right? And then it goes through and literally asks you questions based on the AWS well-architected pillars. And you can answer them however you please. The great news is this actually links out, each question links out to a bunch of AWS resources. So whether those are reInvent talks, whether those are white papers, things like that. And it records this. So behind this is basically a Git repo that will let you version your answers. And so the idea, even though you can answer whatever you want, the idea is this is part of your record of your build. It's part of your audit response. Explaining why you've made certain trade-offs, right? So maybe you can say, at this point, we're not big enough to leverage, if we live in your world, Mike, we can say we're not big enough to leverage a custom model in SageMaker. So we're just using recognition for now to process our images. And here was the deciding factor, was that our volume and the type of thing we were looking for. And then, maybe 6 months from now, that answer changes and says, yes, we've invested in using SageMaker and the entire tool chain to go custom because A, B, C, and D. And so we're taking that trade-off where we're spending more and we are adding operational overhead. But the difference now is we have a far better performance and we have a far more reliable result for our customer, right? So that's why we're making the trade-off. You would record those decisions through the well-architected tool. And so the custom lens idea is that now you as a user or as a partner or somebody else can add questions and add a section into that well-architected tool process. So instead of just having the 5 pillars and some of the default lenses from AWS, I think there's only 2 that are currently added in, which is ridiculous. Now you can add your own. So if you had internal requirements or internal concerns, you can add those in as basically as prompts for your teams. So a good one here from my world is, or even actually crossover both our worlds. If you're in Europe or in Australia or in Canada or Japan, and you're tracking consent for using data for machine learning, right? If we can not just, so in Canada, similar to everywhere else that I just mentioned, when a business takes in data, they have to tell you what they're using it for, and they can only use it for those tasks. And so for things that are sort of considered above the normal, you would ask specifically for permission to do that. You could put that as a prompt in your custom lens to say, hey, did you ask the users, or do you have the ability to segment user data that you're allowed to use for your models and you're not allowed to use for your models based on that consent? So that could be something you could add into a custom lens that's never going to pop up in the generic workflow, but for you, it's absolutely critical. So it could be a really powerful thing, especially with the API behind the tool, because the thing you mentioned where it's just on your honor, or you could use AWS config to track some of this stuff. Now with the API they launched at last reInvent, I'm starting to see teams put in automatic checks for these things and say, you said you were going to do this, and here's what you actually did. There's a difference here. Let's make sure that answer is no. So there's a lot of power here, but it really depends on how people are going to use it.
Yeah, we'll have to wait and see. I really like that point about making sort of geo-specific lenses. I wonder whether local solution architect teams within AWS would even maybe put some of that stuff together. I mean, solutions are not out of the remit of solution architects at AWS, right? So that'd be interesting to see. Yeah, okay, so that's well-architected review. And anything? What's next on your list of things that you're interested in? I suppose before you say that, I should just mention there is a great website from AWS, as there is every single year, aws.amazon.com/new, and you get basically the summary of everything. You just get to come to sessions like this, where you get to hear people talking about it who are not paid by AWS to say the nice things.
Correct. I don't mind calling a spade if something is bad, right? Exactly. And yeah, I think, I mean, for me, it's just the volume, right? So there was a bunch of announcements around CloudWatch today, enhancing some of the metrics and things like that. And so the advantage, so I'm going to spin this in our favor, Mike, the advantage of remote attending is that theoretically, we should be able to try some of this stuff out, as evidence that I've gotten a step further in Inspector than I ever would have on site. I still haven't looked at it, but I got a step further, and that's one step. Yes. So I think that, there's just the sheer volume. I'm really curious to see Adam's keynote tomorrow. His first as the CEO officially, or at least at reInvent. He did reinforce like a 5-minute blurb. So we'll see how that goes. The keynotes for me are always big. Adam's, Werner's, and Peter's. Not to disparage, the global partner one, which just is wrapping up. Or the machine learning one. They're not my interest. I'm sure you're going to be, tuned in, which for me is great because I can just cover just look at your coverage of that kind of thing and go, okay, there's the key points of it. I don't need to sit for 3 hours. I can do the other stuff.
Well, absolutely. We'll have a panel discussion. We're setting this up. So we have a panel discussion. There'll be some people who are at reInvent. There's a little streaming lounge. They're going to be there. We're going to have some people who are at home as well. And we'll condense the 3-hour keynote down to, I don't know, 6 hours, something like that.
Fair. Yeah. The math seems to hold for that. Yeah. It's the challenge here is that so I've been tracking the announcements. So everything I do on reInvent is on my site. So markn.ca/2021/reInvent. It's on the main page anyway. Just go to markn.ca. And I try to put everything I'm doing there. And the challenge I have is there's just so many things, right? So I saw the announcement about the custom lenses, and I just went, okay, I got 1,000,000,001 ideas. I want to dive in right away. And then like 5 minutes later, Inspector dropped and I went, I got 1,000,000,001 ideas. I want to jump in. Yeah, perfect. Thank you. And I want to jump in and I want to look at that, right? And that's not going to stop for the next 3 days, right? Over the next 4 days. Yeah. And so that's fantastic. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm super sad that I'm not on site because, this is the one chance every year that I know I can see you. I can see the rest of the Hero crew, a whole bunch of the AWS community. But I think, there's enough goodies and enough cool stuff coming that we should be having a really good time remotely too.
Absolutely. I was actually contemplating that last night, actually. I've seen you far more often inside of a little square on a screen than I've actually seen you in real life. I mean, It seems crazy. Like obviously the last time we spoke was last year at reInvent, but it was in a situation very similar to this.
Yes.
And so that seems how it is. I think the first time I ever spoke to you was also over a session just like this. I was in a hotel in Virginia somewhere, and yeah, that was a long time ago.
I was going to say, my God, that was a very long time ago. Yeah, and it's funny because like even the I miss and this is the weirdest thing to miss, and this will tell you how deep I'm down the rabbit hole when it comes to this stuff, is that I miss the Monday morning. This is the first, well, besides last year, this is the first time I wasn't at the first sitting of an exam. Monday morning of reInvent. Every year was a tradition for me. I'd go, and there was a bunch of us who would meet. Just unspoken, but we just show up for the first sitting at 7 a.m. And sit whatever exam. Normally it was a beta just to see, okay, like cool, because there were no risks. Because if you failed, you get to write the other again when it's published for free. Sure. And it was a great way to kick off the week. And I even did this morning. I was like, oh, sounds weird, but I missed it.
Yeah, there's no beta exams this year, though, right? No. There's no. I remember that as well. I remember that was one of the times I did see you in person, and we were sat next to each other in the security specialty beta exam, and my distinct memory of that, well, there's a few. Obviously, the technical problems that we had. The other distinct memory I have is this guy sitting next to me, just like tap, 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 tap. Now, you don't have to type in exams, right? Because like you basically just click answering questions. When you're typing, you're giving feedback. And the feedback was accompanied by chuckles and laughs. So you were not well impressed. And that
I was, so yeah, it was the beta was a bad shape. And I actually got a call after that. They called and they're like, you seem to have opinions. Let's talk. And I was like, absolutely. Let's have a chat. Because the problem was for that beta, and thankfully it never saw the light of day, because when it came out in final, it was much better. It was very obviously pulled from a bunch of different people and nobody did the smoothing, right? So they were like, hey, 10, 20 different people, can you all submit questions for this security specialty? And it went from like super easy to didn't make any sense to insanely complicated. And I'm like, that you can't have an exam that is all over the map like that. It's got to be consistent. It's got to be straightforward. And the challenge with the security exam, like all the exams, but I think it may be worse for the security one because it covers everything, is that the pace of change. A bunch of the questions in that beta were already out of date. And like wildly out of date. And that's why I was just like, okay, come on.
I remember there being placeholder text inside some of the questions as well. So it's like, put something here to
yes.
Yeah, no, it was bad.
To be fair, I've seen placeholder text in production in places, so it wasn't that unrealistic.
Right. This is what you should expect from the exam. I remember that it went so badly. We ended up getting all the money refunded and chocolate-covered strawberries delivered to our hotel rooms. I don't know if you remember that. Yeah.
Yes.
Anyway, we're reminiscing about reinvents gone by, and we're supposed to be talking about stuff.
Yes. So anyway, what are you excited about? What are you looking forward to?
Look, I think what I'm looking forward to, there are a couple of other things that have happened today, which I think I'm kind of interested in. I'm interested more from this. I'm not a developer, but I'm interested from the point of view that these things are coming out. Two services that I noticed today. One was CloudWatch Evidently, which I think it's just interesting name. But when I first saw it, I thought it was like CloudWatch Eventually, finally. They think no, but it's not. It's Evidently. This is looking at this is basically feature flags. So feature flags now managed through AWS console. So I kind of feel like if you were doing this already, you probably have a solution for this, but now AWS is bringing this into the fold. I'm not a developer, so I've not got a number of feelings on it, but it does kind of fit again into the sort of well-architected view of an application development. So that was one thing. And there was another thing as well. There was, is it real-time user analysis as well inside of, now I'm just saying that off the top of my head and I didn't prepare for that. Here we go. I'll put the page up. CloudWatch RUM, real-time user monitoring. I think this is interesting as well, because this is both, again, it's pushing telemetry out into code that's running, I guess in AWS, it doesn't have to, so that you can gather more information about the way that the application is working. Both of these services seem to work in that kind of way. So pushing stuff out into the development space there. Again, services that exist already, but AWS see the need to bring that in-house.
So I think, and for RUM, which I'm going to call it forever, is the idea there is embedding those metrics in like your Amplify client and stuff like that, so that it reports back in, right? And so that you've got all of your visibility of what's going on. So you've got your back end and your front end merging in, and that combines with the third CloudWatch event or CloudWatch announcement, which was Insights, which is in preview, which is very, very cool. Looking at trends over all your operational metrics at scale, so millions and millions of things pulling together. And I think really what it is, if you look at all three of these together, is that they identify, AWS has obviously identified a need where people keep saying, I need more visibility, I need more I need more tools that go beyond monitoring into observability. And that's really key. And I think it feels like AWS is taking the same approach they do in the security world, which is we are going to deliver a good enough service for a lot of people. So for maybe 80% of the people out there. And then for the other 20%, we know you're going to go use something else. You're going to use Honeycomb, or you're going to use Launch Darkly for the feature flags or something like that, because you know this stuff and you need something more robust. But for the people who have never used a feature flag before, who have never stepped into the observability space, these tools are going to be good enough. And if from the usability perspective, they're a click away. Right. And so it's really, you can't, look that over. Like, you really have to pay attention to the fact that it's there. It's not another account. It's not another sign up. It's not another tool to deploy. Like, it's just
another purchase order. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think it's good. It is also keeping in with reInvent tradition, that every year there was a section of the expo that got obliterated by an announcement, right? Inevitably, there was like, oh, AWS is now doing this, and this startup, they're all gone because there wasn't enough differentiation. So, I think observability is the next space where they're coming for, because there's a lot of people who play just slightly beyond monitoring, and it isn't good enough anymore. So, it'll be interesting.
Sure. So yeah, absolutely. So what you're saying there, absolutely. So if you're developing applications already, and you're basically your world, you didn't have a world before AWS, and so you're deploying applications in AWS, and then you see services announced, and you go, oh, that's a thing, I can go and do that. Then you start to use CloudWatch logs, and you're pushing all your logs in there, and then you go to somewhere like reInvent, and you go, oh, what's Datadog? What's Sumo Logic? Okay, that's a thing, and you can graduate out and move on. So I suppose your point there is, like, these developers aren't going to be looking at something like Honeycomb because they don't necessarily know that it exists, and so this sort of gives them their on ramp to that.
Exactly. They don't know if it exists, and if they do know it exists, they might not be ready for it yet.
Yeah, sure.
Right. And there's a big learning curve on all this stuff. You got to think there's so many services and so many features. Like, even for me, so I'm dipping my toe in the machine learning world in AWS. I've been yeah, exactly. Right. Come on board. It's like me with the security. Like, oh, you mentioned security. Hello. But I mean, I've been in computational intelligence for a very long time in general, just not doing a bunch of the machine learning stuff. And so getting into it, it can be super intimidating, because you look at SageMaker and you're just like, oh my God, what is it? What isn't it at this point? Right? Like, it's everything. And it totally makes sense. It's, they really just need to call it SageMaker IDE. And it's just the whole bit, and it's got everything you need, but that can be super intimidating. So, from the machine learning side, it's like, yeah, okay, there's no that we're using comprehend and transcribe and recognition for those machine learning tasks that are simple enough to do that way, or common enough to do that way. And eventually then, I hope to graduate out into building out some custom stuff in SageMaker. And I hope I never get down into the deep learning AMI. Right. I just want to stay. That middle layer seems like a really sweet spot to be.
I think so. Yes. I think SageMaker could. I don't think they should at all, but it absolutely almost could spin off into its own complete thing altogether. I mean, like with SSO, you can sign into the studio and never have to look at the console ever again. Yes. Okay, cool. I just want to, I don't want to keep you too much longer. I know you've been being pulled around all over the place. Let's talk. You mentioned before just about what I'm looking forward to in the rest of the week. I'll open this one and this part of the discussion. A huge part of what I'm assuming is going to be the keynote. I don't have any specific level knowledge about this, but a huge amount I'm assuming is going to be around sustainability. Like, it's if you think about COP26 was front and center of everybody's mind when the finishing touches were being put on reInvent presentations, at least. Yeah. I know the news media cycle seems to have moved on, and obviously they've got other things to talk about now, which is part of the reasons why we're not at reInvent. But but sustainability and AWS, I suppose what I'm looking for there is just more statements, more support for where Amazon is going in general. They've signed up to the Climate Pledge. In fact, I think they are the founding members of the Climate Pledge. And so I'm going to be really interested to see what they come out with. I'm wanting to see more transparency. I'm wanting to see more transparency from AWS in terms of what they're doing. They have some sort of requirement to report yearly. It'd be brilliant if we could see a little bit more in depth than that. Your thoughts on sustainability?
Yeah, I think you're spot on. It's a super important thing, especially if you look over the last 6 months, the attention paid to like crypto mining farms and stuff, and the power consumption there. because they're the other big power draw when it comes to computation. And people are raising that question of what's the value of that activity, versus the environmental impact. Now, obviously, a cloud data center is extremely, or in this case, a region is extremely different, because there's a variety of workloads and a huge amount of businesses being run on top of it. But we did see it last year, some of that, starting to come in. Peter DeSantis, his keynote covered a whole bunch of stuff, because he always goes behind the scenes, right, of how AWS does AWS. And so when Peter started talking, he was talking about how concrete was made, which is a weird thing, but super interesting. I never thought I'd be fascinated by 5 minutes of concrete. But he was talking about the environmental impact and how much concrete goes into their data centers, and like they had to figure out, like, how do we do this better? So I agree. I think we're going to see a lot of that. I think Adam might mention it tomorrow in the main keynote, in keynote number 1, but I think Peter's probably the guy who's going to go deeper, because AWS, that's my gut feeling, just because AWS is so practical, is that they don't want to come out and, it doesn't feel AWS-y to come out and be like, yay, we're good for climate. They're more like, look, this is what we did. This is what we're doing. Like we re-engineered this chip to use less cobalt, and we use this cable so that we use less of this mineral and things like that. So I think more practical things. But I think what they're going to miss there is maybe what you're looking for, which is the overall accomplishment. Instead of just diving into the minutia, tell us how much more you're pushing forward, and not some hand wavy, well, this percentage of power is green. Like, how are you moving it forward? And, are you helping anything broader than yourselves? One of the super fascinating thing, somewhat off topic, but on topic, Vice does a lot of great longer YouTube videos exploring a specific thing. And they were looking, neither of us being American, but I'll bring up an American example because it was a good video. They were looking at the problem about sustainable energy in the US. And the problem isn't generation, it's transport. And they identified this multi-university study had looked at how much was going to be required to invest in the grid to be able to move the power around, especially in the American Midwest. They're perfect for wind and solar because it's flat and there's nothing there. But you can't get the power out to where it needs to be, to the coasts where people consume it. So they have this, in Australia is similar geographically. I mean, Canada is similar geographically as well. We got all the space and we got all the resources, but it's so far away from people. How do you get it effectively? And I thought that was crying out for a good technology solution. And for investment in there. And I want to see AWS not just telling us what they're doing now, but I'd like to see them expanding and taking on that sort of broader thing of saying like, hey, we've identified through our research that this is an issue because we hit it. Here's how we're solving it. And here's how we're going to help other people outside of what we're, outside of our little sphere. Here's how we're going to do a greater good. Because I think that's really where we're at.
Yeah, carbon credits only gets you so far, right? And AWS are already, sorry, Amazon. I need to make sure I'm framing this correctly. Amazon make the right noises about carbon credits already. They say that they buy them, they don't trade them. So that they there's a terminology for it. They retire them, I think.
Yes.
So that's good.
That's awesome.
I hear what you're saying. So you can invest in all these renewable energy schemes, but if they're nowhere near where everybody needs to use the power, then there's a disconnect there. So what can they do to fix that or help?
Yeah, and I mean, my thinking there isn't that they're obligated to do that. It's just that they, having watched the talks, the Monday Night Lives, the Tuesday Night Lives, and then now Peter's full-time keynote, the amount of low-level innovation that AWS comes up with really blows me away, because they're dealing with these problems at a scale that nobody else is dealing with, and they've got such a great set of engineering culture that I have to imagine they've come across something wiring up all these global regions where they went, you know what, this is a way more efficient way to transfer power, or this is a way more efficient way to set things up, and we're going to help everybody else get there as well. Just a wish list item.
Yeah, no, I think that sounds quite reasonable, actually. I really do enjoy those technical talks. Who was it? Distinguished engineer that lives on the boat, and I've now forgotten his name.
James Hamilton?
Yes. His was the first one that I saw of the technical split talks. I have gone back to that in years gone by. It's so interesting and so out of the normal kind of like, here's the new service, you must get across this and you must know everything about this. It's like, no, actually, we've been working. I'm not going to show you the numbers from this year, but this is like the numbers from 2 years ago. And you can imagine that we've been advancing since then. And look at this new technology, and we're using the ocean to transmit data and all this kind of stuff. Amazing.
Well, what blew me away was one of those talks, and I think it was James, when they talked about their risk calculations on data center generators and how they had to rewrite the firmware because the default mode was save the generator if something went wrong. And they were like, no, 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 we're at the size of scale where it's kill the generator to save the other thing. And to do that, they literally, the company wasn't going to switch it. So their engineering team rewrote a power generator's firmware and then basically hacked it in so that it would blow up instead of the data center. And I was like, okay, that's super cool. Like, just wow. But that's a whole different scale of problems and a whole different way of looking at the world. And yeah, it continues to be one of my favorites. Though James hasn't given a talk in a while.
No, he hasn't. No, I haven't seen. I saw him actually, and said hello to him in 2019, so the last physical reInvent that I was at. But I didn't see him give a presentation. Yeah, the brutal logic of running at such mass economies of scale that you have there is it's cool to see sometimes, I think. So yeah, I think it'd be interesting to see that. Yeah, I hadn't really thought about that from that point of view, of that large scale, what we can do to enhance sustainability, decrease energy consumption is essentially the end game with all of that in terms of data centers, I imagine. I'd be very interested to see how they can assist customers in this space as well, like how they can help people like us know what our impact is. Broadly speaking, at the moment, I think that's the bill. Like, if your bill is small, then you're probably not consuming very much. But it'd be interesting to see a little bit more detail than that.
Well, and that's part of the push behind the Graviton 2 efforts, right? Like, Graviton's popping up everywhere now, and I think it's a given that we're going to see a new chip of some sort, if not multiples. But I think you're going to see in those presentations as well, that angle, that environmental impact angle. Which is something I've had interesting conversations with teams when they're trying to understand, like, well, why would I bother with Graviton? I'm not getting the same performance out of each instance. So what's the point? And then you show them the economics. Well, yeah, but if you scale out, you're getting more value for less. And, behind the scenes, it would be lovely to know what the actual energy impact was. Right. So if I scaled out 10 Graviton instances versus 2, like quadruple extra large, and I'm still accomplishing my task in the time I want, I'd love to know that, I'm consuming 1/10 of the power than if I took the 2 big ones. That would be nice just to remind us, because I think, this is like security, to bring it back to my wheelhouse. It's, if you're not constantly reminded, you forget about it. And it's too easy to remember that I can spin up 1,000 servers if I need to, but should I? Like, if I can wait an extra hour and only spin up 10, or better yet, can I convert to serverless designs for things and ephemeral workloads? And there things I can do to run my workloads at times when energy supply is high and demand is low, right? Like, those kind of things. I think you're right. It'll be interesting to see if they can help us understand our impact and change our behaviors.
Mark, thank you so much for joining me in my this morning, your this evening, and for whatever else. I got a clock up there with UTC, so I can kind of like claim that I've got everybody covered. Thank you so much. If people want to find you throughout the whole of reInvent, I guess your website that we flashed up a moment ago, and just follow you on Twitter is probably the best place.
Yeah, I would say
just there over there.
Right there, at Mark NCA. I'm at Mark NCA everywhere. It's easier than my last name because my last name goes across the entirety of the camera.
I have to Google it most times. Yeah,
just hold the N key down until it breaks, and that's me. I appreciate the opportunity. It's, as always, an absolute pleasure. I'm really looking forward to your coverage of reInvent, because you always do such a great job. And for those of you who are watching, I think we're on LinkedIn as well, right? As YouTube.
I pressed the LinkedIn button. I don't know. I'm in touch with LinkedIn to try and make it work. We'll see.
Oh, nice. If you're on LinkedIn and tuning in, you absolutely should head over to Mike's YouTube. He's got a slew of phenomenal videos. They are excellent. I cannot recommend them enough. If you're on YouTube, good for you. You've already figured it out. You found the treasure trove. But yeah, Mike, always a pleasure. And I hope we chat again real soon, and that you enjoy the rest of virtual reInvent.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. And I'll see you again soon.
All right. Take care.
Cheers. Bye.